You don't know yourself. Don't worry. It's through no fault of your own. Even if you are one of those lucky few who've had the time and energy to reflect on your life and your experiences coherently and critically with the explicit goal of self-understanding, it would have been impossible for you, I think, to develop an accurate answer to the question, who am I? Because until very recently, the species has not been able to investigate its own nature scientifically. The tools, practices, and ideas necessary for such an investigation simply did not exist. As a result, we have all inherited from philosophers and religious thinkers ideas about our brains, mind, and human nature that are much more akin to astrology than astronomy. Hi, I'm Sterling Lynch, and in this episode of Thinking Matters, I want to convince you that the way you think about yourself, that is your identity, your sense of self, and your understanding of the relationship between your brain, mind, and human nature, is wrong. To do this, I'm going to introduce you to some important, exciting, and quite frankly, mind-blowing discoveries in psychology and neuroscience. These discoveries will force you, I think, to reevaluate how you think about yourself. I also want to leave you with a few ideas that I think will be useful to you if you decide, as I hope you will, to pursue a new answer to the question, who am I? Let's get started. If you're like me, when you introspect, that is, when you turn your focus inwards to examine your own thoughts and feelings, the first thing you probably notice is your inner monologue, that babbling brook of words, thoughts, and ideas which observes, narrates, and reflects almost continuously. But once you are aware of that monologue, you should also notice that there is another aspect of your consciousness that is aware of that monologue, listening, hearing, and yet is in some way distinct and separate from the ongoing monologue. If you continue to introspect, you will also begin to notice that there are other impulses, desires, and ideas that pop into your awareness that are also distinct from your inner monologue and the other listening awareness. These impulses, desires, and ideas seemingly come from nowhere and return to nowhere. Sometimes our inner monologue struggles to contain and control these impulses when they are negative in nature or contrary to our longer-term goals. Other times, our inner monologue welcomes and encourages them when they are useful or helpful. Overall, in whatever way our inner monologue reacts to these impulses, it ultimately feels to me, and I'm sure to you, like the inner monologue has the final say and ultimate control over our behavior. Moreover, no matter how conflicted and divided we might sometimes feel, the contents of our conscious mind nevertheless ultimately seems unified and, well, distinctly you. Well, it turns out that this plausible, intuitive, and even pleasing understanding of the brain's operations is almost certainly wrong. But don't take my word for it. Take instead the word and words of Michael S. Gazzaniga, a professor of psychology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, who also heads the Sage Center for the Study of the Mind. He writes, "The brain has millions of local processors making important decisions. It is a highly specialized system with critical networks distributed throughout the 1,300 grams of tissue. There is no one boss in the brain. You are certainly not the boss of the brain." But how is that possible? If you're like me, you have a deep and profound sense that you are in fact a single unified consciousness, which also happens to run the show. That is the boss of your brain, mind, and behavior. Research indicates, however, that there is one unique and localized part of the human brain, dubbed the interpreter module, that receives the results of the decisions of other, more or less independent parts of the brain. The interpreter module reacts and responds to the inputs of these other modules and creates our experience of a unified and in-charge consciousness. Notice, however, the interpreter module operates in the past tense. It reacts and responds, weaving the experience of consciousness out of decisions made elsewhere in the brain and after the fact of them being made. Our conscious mind can affect and influence the other decision-making parts of the brain, but it remains only one voice among very many. In sum, your conscious mind, despite your experience to the contrary, is not in charge of your brain, mind, or behavior. But wait a minute. If our conscious mind is not in charge, who is? Well, the answer seems to be that no one part of our brain is always and explicitly in charge. Instead, a kind of anarchy of unconscious processes that are unknown to our conscious mind, but which are well aware of their environment. work together and compete to determine our feelings, thoughts, experiences, beliefs, and behavior on a moment-to-moment basis. After the unconscious processes come up with an immediate response to the environment, our conscious mind integrates that response into the overall story of our mind, behavior, and identity, and creates the impression that the conscious mind is in charge. The unconscious mind, in other words, steers the ship of you, but the conscious mind takes credit for it, even when it really doesn't know how the ship is steered or who is steering it. So who is this stranger in the midst of our mind who really is running the show? Contemporary psychology and neuroscience has been able to peek behind the curtain of consciousness, and they have discovered an unconscious that is far more complex, rational, and human than we might have otherwise expected. If you're like me, and you grew up in a Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic society like Canada, whether you've heard of him or not, your understanding of the unconscious has been deeply shaped by Sigmund Freud, an Austrian neurologist and the father of psychoanalysis. His ideas about the human mind have dominated the Western world's understanding of brains, mind, and human nature ever since he first shared them at the start of the 20th century. In Freud's early model of the mind, the unconscious refers to our basic, amoral, instinctual drives, bodily needs, wants, desires, and impulses, particularly our sexual and aggressive drives. They are, according to Freud, chaotic, instinctual, full of energy and contradictions. They are unconscious, that is, unknown and unknowable to the conscious mind, precisely because they need to be contained. In Freud's language, repressed, by our conscious mind so that we can function adequately in society. In his later model of the mind, Freud suggests that the unconscious encompasses much more than these amoral and bestial impulses, but it is the original characterization of the unconscious as a repressed animal nature that continues to shape our everyday understanding of the unconscious mind, especially in popular culture. The scientific research, however, is revealing a very different characterization of the unconscious and how it relates to the conscious mind. Following Daniel Kahneman, the Israeli-American psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, it is even becoming more common to dispense with the terms unconscious and conscious mind. Instead, Kahneman uses the expressions System 1 and System 2 to distinguish between two broad styles of thinking our brains employ in their interactions with their environment. System 1 refers to all those parts of our brains that are automatic, quick, effortless, intuitive, and not controlled voluntarily, with what we might have previously called the unconscious mind. System 2, in contrast, refers to the parts of our brains responsible for our attentive, effortful, and analytical mental activity, and the subjective experience of agency, choice, and concentration, what we might have previously called our conscious mind. In this new model, the brain processes of System 1 are neither amoral, irrational, or bestial. Instead, they are the steady workhorses of our existence, experience, and thinking, providing a continuous assessment of the main problems that the human organism must solve on a moment-to-moment basis in order to survive. They reason about the world in a variety of ways that are not always perfectly rational or accurate, but are good enough for the environments in which we evolved, even if they aren't always perfect for the environments in which we now live. System 2, in contrast, can monitor and exercise some control over some of the experiences, thoughts, beliefs, and actions created and proposed by System 1. System 2 also has some ability to change the way System 1 works in the long run by retraining some of its automatic functions. System 2, however, is lazy, easily distracted, and easily tired. When System 2's attention lapses, which is often, System 1 essentially runs the show. And that means System 1, unbeknownst to System 2, is steering the ship of your brain most of the time. One of the important consequences of this new understanding of the brain is the fact that we have only limited access to who we are, because most of who we are happens in our unconscious brain processes, which are unknown and in most cases unknowable to our conscious minds. Kahneman writes, "The notion that we have limited access to the workings of our minds is difficult to accept because, naturally, it is alien to our experience. But it is true. You know far less about yourself than you feel you do." It would be fair to say, I think, that most researchers investigating the brain today now accept the notion that mind is simply something that brains do. In the same way that kidneys produce urine, brains produce mind. Are there reasons, however, to doubt the notion that one mind is reducible to one brain? My kidney produces my urine, but can we be sure that my brain alone produces my mind? Might there be more to who you are than the operations of your brain? Tentatively, I'd like to suggest to you that the answer to that last question is probably yes. Consider this. Although we all feel, I'm sure, like our minds happen, exist, or somehow live in our brains somewhere just behind our eyes, we also know that not all of the experiences a brain produces are veridical, that is, in line with reality. For example, because of damage or research-driven trickery, our brains can be convinced that we have limbs we don't actually have, that the limbs we have aren't our own, or that our minds can float freely outside of our bodies. We've also seen that our conscious minds aren't really in charge, even when it seems to us that they are. So, there is no reason to believe that the experience of our minds living in our brains is proof that one brain is solely responsible for one mind. Consider this next. In social psychology, that is, the scientific study of how people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are influenced by the actual imagined or implied presence of others, many experiments demonstrate that we often act very differently, even become different people in certain social situations. Take as an example the infamous Stanford prison experiment, in which researchers took an average group of healthy, intelligent, middle-class young men and arbitrarily divided them into guards and prisoners with the flip of a coin. The young men were slow to adopt their new roles, but once they did, the roles seemed to take over, causing them to behave in ways contrary to their normal character. This experiment, among others, suggests that the roles we adopt and the relationships into which we enter have a profound effect on the kinds of minds our brains produce. It is almost as if a mind only really emerges because of its interactions with other brains. Third, we also know that other, seemingly brain-independent aspects of our physiology affect our mind. For example, I'm sure at some point in your life you have experienced the hangries, when a person becomes irrationally angry simply because he or she is very hungry. Hunger and other brain-independent states of the body seem to have a profound effect on our minds. Along similar but possibly much more dramatic lines, researchers have discovered bacteria in our stomach that produces neurochemicals that may be able to influence our brain. There's lots of work to be done to determine what effect, if any, of these neurochemicals in our stomach have on our brains and minds. But it may turn out that there's much more than metaphor at work when you tell yourself to trust your gut. Of course, having said all that, the question of whether or not your mind is the unique result of your brain might boil down to a simple matter of how and where we draw the line between your brain, the rest of your body, and your environment. For example, thinking of the Stanford prison experiment, we might say that a mind emerges between the interactions of many brains, but we might also say that one brain produces different kinds of mind depending on how it responds to different features of its environment, which includes other brains. David Eagleman, an American neuroscientist and writer, strikes a nice balance between these two interpretations of mind when he suggests that the latest science points to a broader sociobiological account of the person in which the brain is the densest concentration of you, but not all of what you are. Whether one mind is reducible to one brain or not, it is nevertheless clear that you will need to look at much more than the contents of your mind if you want to develop a complete and coherent answer to the question, who am I? On August 1st, 1966, Charles Whitman, a former Marine and engineering student at the University of Texas, went on an infamous murderous spree. He killed his mother, wife, 13 other people, and wounded 30 before he was shot to death by police in the University of Texas Tower. What is perhaps less well known is that in the lead-up to his murderous spree, Whitman strongly suspected that his brain was not working properly. He sought medical treatment and even tried to turn himself into the police. In the notes and writings that he left behind, he also expresses confusion and remorse over his actions. So strong was his suspicion that his violent urges had a biological origin. In one note, he even requests that his brain be examined after his death. An autopsy was performed. His brain examined, and a tumor was discovered, impinging on those parts of his brain involved in the regulation of emotions like fear and aggression. Had the tumor been detected and removed, there is good reason to believe Whitman's murderous spree might never have happened. David Eagleman, the American neuroscientist and writer I mentioned previously, cites the case of Charles Whitman and many others to make the following claim. Criminals should always be treated as incapable of having acted otherwise. The criminal activity itself should be taken as evidence of brain abnormality, regardless whether currently measured problems can be pinpointed. For Eagleman, the arc of science is unequivocal. As we learn more about the brain, it is becoming increasingly clear that criminal behavior ultimately originates in abnormal biology, a biology over which a person has little or no control. Today's criminal behavior, in other words, is tomorrow's medical condition. Although we don't yet have the tools to understand all the biology at the root of all criminal behavior, he thinks, as a matter of justice, we should treat all criminal behavior as a symptom of an underlying issue in biology. It's simply unjust, Eagleman thinks, to treat some people as criminals only because we don't yet have the science to identify and understand the biology at the root of their behavior. Instead of looking backwards and asking if a criminal might have done other than he or she did, Eagleman suggests the criminal justice system should look forward and assess whether or not treatment, training, or rehabilitation will reduce or eliminate the chance that the behavior will be repeated. Essentially, Eagleman is advocating for a justice system that focuses on rehabilitation rather than punishment. He is, nevertheless, adamant. When treatment, training, or rehabilitation is ineffective, perpetual incarceration may be the only option. In some extreme cases, he is even prepared to accept that we may need to lock some criminals away and throw away the key. Although Eagleman is concerned with the criminal justice system and criminal behavior, I suspect his conclusions are also relevant in our own day-to-day lives. We, all of us, strive to live by our own standards and high ideals, and sometimes fail to live up to them without necessarily acting in ways that are, strictly speaking, criminal. Instead of blaming those missteps on a failure of will and punishing ourselves, we should focus our energies on training ourselves to act differently in the future. In this way, we can develop a much more productive relationship between our conscious and unconscious minds, in which the conscious mind is more like a teacher and coach than a ruler and king. We began this short video by examining what we experience when we introspect. That is, when we focus inwardly to examine our own thoughts and feelings. We noticed that it felt to us like our conscious mind is unified in control and ultimately who we are. Since then, I've introduced you to some important discoveries in psychology and neuroscience, which indicate that the experience of introspection misrepresents how our brain and mind actually works. We've seen that the brain is like a mosaic, made up of thousands of independent brain processes, and that our experience of having one unified mind is created by one specific part of the brain, called the interpreter module. We've also seen that the brain is anarchical, which is to say, no single part of the brain rules over all the others. We've also learned that there's probably much more to who we are than the isolated operations of our brain. A brain does not produce mind in a vacuum, and the kind of mind it produces is profoundly influenced by its environment. Finally, we also discussed how criminal behavior ultimately has its roots in biology, a biology over which a person has no control. For this reason, instead of asking if a criminal could have done other than he or she did, the justice system should focus on how best to ensure the criminal behavior is not repeated. In line with this insight about the justice system, I suggested we might adopt a similar attitude in our own lives. When we act in ways not in line with our goals, values, and desires, we should focus our energies on training ourselves to act in the ways we want, rather than worrying too much about whether or not we might have done differently had we tried harder. Taken together, these discoveries represent an important and perhaps radical shift in perspective. For almost 400 years, ever since Descartes famously quipped, "I think, therefore I am," the Western world has been ruled by the conceit that introspection is the most reliable and accurate means to self-understanding and knowledge, that a person can, in fact, know him or herself, and that he or she can be confident that most, if not all, of his or her beliefs about the contents of his or her mind are true. That conceit, it turns out, is almost certainly wrong. According to the latest and best research, much of who you are is inaccessible through introspection, and much of what you believe about yourself is often wrong. So, in light of this new perspective on self-understanding, how should you go about answering the question, who am I? Well, first and foremost, be humble. Accept that you know far less about yourself than you think you know. Accept that self-knowledge and understanding is not easily acquired. And also accept that solitary introspection won't provide an adequate answer to the question, who am I? Second, because introspection is not a reliable path to self-understanding, seek to understand yourself in the same way you would try to understand someone else. Rather than looking inwards, look outwards. For example, look to the insights of your friends, colleagues, and even strangers. Carefully scrutinize how they respond and react to you and your behavior. Reflect on the nature of your relationships and what they might say about you as a person. Keep a journal, and when you reread it, analyze it as if someone else wrote it. Third, reconceive the relationship between your conscious and unconscious minds. Instead of imagining your conscious mind as a kind of king that rules over the rest of the brain, think of it as a kind and caring teacher, which is guiding the rest of your brain to the best version of itself. The best teachers are patient, adapt to the needs of their students, and understand that teaching takes time. Teachers won't ever know all there is to know about their students, but they use what they do know to help their students become better people. And finally, remember to enjoy the journey. Whoever you are, were, or will be, you are constantly evolving and adapting, and who you are won't be reducible to a laundry list of facts and figures. In fact, a complete answer to the question, who am I, might always be just out of reach. It is said that if our brains were simple enough to be understood, we wouldn't be complex enough to understand them. Similarly, if you were simple enough to be understood easily, you probably wouldn't be complex enough to ask and answer the question, who am I? Thanks for your time and attention. If you have any questions or feedback, leave a comment below or drop me a note at sterling.lynch@gmail.com. Oh, if you noticed and are wondering about the individual letters I included in each of the chapter titles, here's the explanation. If you write them out in order, you will find that they spell a word that is an anagram of another word, which is one half of a word, which is very relevant to this video. If you email me the second word in the subject heading, I will email you a PDF of the transcript that I used to make this video. Bye for now.